What's up, everyone? Today we're going to talk about 3 kinds of elms and elm propagation. I have here on the table a Seiju elm, which is a variety of Chinese Corkbark elm, as well as a regular Chinese Corkbark elm. Chinese elms come in regular bark, which is relatively smooth and has sort of a puzzle pattern, but they also come in a corkbark variety, and it's nice and rough, rugged bark that's really good for making interesting bonsai compositions. So on the right here is a Seiju elm, and you can see that the leaves on this are significantly smaller than the regular corkbark variety. And the same thing is true if you had just like one of the smooth bark varieties, the leaves would be more like this one. So these, I don't know the full backstory, but these are actually not common outside of the United States. I believe these were nursery cultivars that were introduced within the US. And if anyone knows better, you can leave it in the comments below. In any case, this leaf does get a little bit bigger than this, but you can see that these leaves are absolutely tiny. And there's an even tinier variety called Hokkaido, but that variety is really hard to train. These guys actually make really good small to medium-sized bonsai. You can make really good shohin out of them. And obviously, with this type of leaf size, you could also make mame out of them. So we just added these for sale on Bonsaify.com if you want to pick up a couple. And these guys are a little bit more vigorous than the Seiju. If you leave them to their natural habit, Seiju will top out at a sort of more like a vase-shaped tree, while these regular corkbark elms will get to be a much larger tree. And I find that these are really great for medium and large trees. The leaf size reduces, so this is a relatively large leaf, and you can see that there are smaller leaves here on the tree. And if you want to pick some of these up, we also added these to Bonsaify.com. The last variety I want to talk about is this, Ulmus Crassifolia, also called Texas Cedar Elm. It actually has nothing to do with cedar. The name just comes from the fact that in its native environment in the southeast US, it actually just associates with eastern red cedar, which isn't even a cedar, it's actually a juniper. Gotta love common names. In any case, Crassifolia just is an indication of the fact that the foliage and the leaves are kind of thicker and tougher feeling than other elm leaves. So you can see these are quite a bit bigger than the Chinese elm leaves. They also reduce, but they don't reduce quite as much as Chinese elms. I find these to be really interesting subjects for bonsai, and I haven't explored them too much. But one of the things that I find really interesting is that these vigorous twigs have little wings on them, almost like a euonymus or something like that. And so, unfortunately, these wings don't really stick around. They kind of fall off, but then the trees also have nice rugged bark and some really good fast growth characteristics. A really good species for bonsai. We don't have these currently available, but we are propagating them and we'll be selling them in the future. Elm propagation is best accomplished through a process of taking cuttings from trees that have the exact genetics that you would like to duplicate. As in the case with junipers, it is easy to end up with genetics that you don't want if you start from something like a seed source. Luckily, elms are even easier to propagate than junipers, and so I'm going to go over a couple of different techniques. Behind me here I have the 6 1-gallon elms that I've been growing out for a couple of years, and I'm just going to cut off a piece here. So the standard kind of cutting technique is to take vigorous shoots like these guys and cut them into between 5 and 8 inches in length, and then you would strip the bottom leaves off. You can also take off any tender tips that are growing to reduce the water stress, but basically process all your cuttings to look like that. So just go through quickly. The health of the plant that you are getting the cuttings from is important, and so these guys that I've had growing out in the field here, it's midsummer and they're growing vigorously thanks to good watering and fertilization and lots of sun. These types of cuttings are going to be really reliable. You're going to be able to make a lot of them, and so if you want a lot of elms, you can basically go find the tree that has the bark that you like and find vigorous shoots like this, process them, and then we'll look at sticking them in a minute here. I'm going to set these aside. If you want to try your hand at using slightly larger wood for making cuttings on elms, it is possible. And so what I do sometimes is essentially doing like a heel cutting. So I've got a side branch here and then a larger branch below. So I've made this kind of short because I don't want like a big section that's all straight. But these types of cuttings are not going to be as reliable, but if you want to make cuttings and not have to wait for them to bulk up as much, you can get cuttings of elm to take that are larger than, I guess I need to sharpen my pruners. You can get elm cuttings to take that are larger than just, say, like a really fresh shoot off of a tree. So this is an example of a tree that was actually created from a root cutting. The process of creating root cuttings is basically you take a reasonably large size root, maybe like the size of my pinky or larger. This one was about this size when I took the cutting, and you remove it from the tree. You then bury essentially the entire thing minus the cut site and leave that cut site just sitting right above the soil. Basically, because these guys have the ability to create new shoots from the cambium layer directly rather than from buds that are on the side, they will then make a ring of buds and start growing again, as long as they have enough fine roots down below in order to make that happen. Some of the roots that the cuttings that I took didn't take, but it was probably about 50-50, but I wasn't really being super careful when I did it. The advantages of root cuttings are kind of interesting because you can use a really big root in order to make a tree relatively quickly. But the disadvantage is that you're sort of building in reverse taper into your composition. And so I would tend to not use really big roots for cuttings because you're going from something small to something big, and once you expose that, it's going to look like the trunk is really odd. But the roots can have really interesting curves, and in this case there's some sort of weird bark formations that I kind of like on them. And because I used just a short portion of the root rather than some giant piece, the reverse taper issue doesn't seem to have really reared its ugly head. I would say if you've had an elm that came from a nursery and has a lot of old big roots on it and you have to hack them all off anyway, give a shot at doing root cuttings just to see what happens. You might be delighted by the results. All right, I've got some Hormex number 8 here, which is 8,000 parts per million of IBA. That might be actually a little bit high for elms, but I've used it before without any noticeable problems. The type of hormone that you use is not super important because almost all rooting hormones contain the same active ingredients or one of just a couple of active ingredients. So some people like gels, some people like liquids, some people like powders, but they're all going to work relatively well. And I would guess that you could even get some of these to take without any rooting hormone whatsoever. You can also, if you have a willow tree nearby, just sort of take some cuttings off of a willow branch, soak them in water, and use that as a rooting hormone. That's actually, if I am remembering my horticultural history correctly, the origin of rooting hormone. All right, so I've dipped this in the powder, and then I'm just going to stick it in here like that into my little container. You know, when I do these for Bonsaify, I do large Anderson flats, which have mesh bottoms, and we'll take a look at those in a minute. But for you guys, if you just want to do a few of them, you basically just dip and stick these guys. And this part of the process is not really the most important part because it's relatively straightforward, but make a variety of sizes. So I've got one here. I'm going to pull off that top. And then where did that one go? That was, there it is. So this guy, if you're going to stick it, I would put basically the entire larger section down into the soil, leaving just that small portion sticking up. That gives it more area to root from. They may root from along the stem, or they may root from tissue right here at the end. It kind of depends on the day of the week, I guess. But you know, compared to junipers, these are much more likely to callus at the end and then root directly from there. Whereas with juniper cuttings, a lot of times they will root along the side of the twig that you stick. The other thing you're going to see is that these are going to root a lot quicker than a juniper, and they're going to take off, starting to grow almost immediately after they've rooted, setting out new buds from the base of each one of these leaves that are on here. If the leaves fall off, it doesn't necessarily mean that the cutting has failed. So give it a little bit of time. You want to take this once you've got all your cuttings processed and put it somewhere that's relatively moist, or create a cool shaded environment, not dark, but very out of any direct sun. So one technique that you can use is basically to just cover this in plastic. All right, so I went ahead and watered this so that the soil is wet, and I'm just going to try and see if I can fit this into this plastic bag by gently getting these guys all together. Perfect. And then a rubber band would work, but I couldn't find one, so I'm just going to use this scrap of aluminum wire to kind of cinch down the base of this plastic bag against the side of the pot so that it's not likely to let as much air in there. And actually probably would have preferred a rubber band, but that will work relatively fine. What this is going to do is act kind of like a tiny little greenhouse. So the reason you want to keep it out of the sun is that the smaller a greenhouse is, the faster it heats up and cools down. So put this in indirect light and you should get some growth starting to pop just within a couple of weeks. Now again, the timing on this can be important. So obviously this isn't going to work in the middle of winter. There wouldn't be any leaves on there. But here we are in the middle of summer. You should start to see from the heat and that indirect light, as well as the 100% moisture that is going to be retained in here, some of that growth starting relatively quickly if the cuttings are going to take. The other thing is leaving the bottom open here allows excess moisture to dry, and you can just dunk this into a bucket of water if you're concerned that too much moisture is escaping, or remove it, water it, and put the plastic back. Now that we've done that, basically small scale, let's take a look at how I do this at a little bit larger scale. Here are 4 flats of elms that we stuck maybe a couple of days ago, and in the greenhouse environment, these guys stay a lot more moist because there's irrigation underneath the benches, and then they're under this electronic leaf system. The way this works is that the mesh screen on the electronic leaf is underneath the sprayers, just like the leaves of the trees, and so when it dries out, it lifts up and then the sprayers come on. After the sprayers go off, then the misters go off and the leaves are kept just barely wet to improve the rooting percentage by reducing the stress on the plants. Once the cuttings have rooted, it's really best to wait for dormancy before you try transplanting them. That's not to say that you can't do it while they're actively growing. We took these cuttings last summer, and then over the winter I potted them up into these 3-inch containers to grow out. I let them grow for probably, let's see, it's July, so they've been growing in these containers since March. And you can see that the roots have started to populate here, and I actually cut these back. I had kept them in the greenhouse for a while. So I cut off the long shoots that they tend to make when they're in shade. So they've started budding out again. You know, the real advantage of doing your own propagation for bonsai purposes is that you get to have complete control over not only the genetic material that you're propagating, but also the shape that you're propagating. And so these guys, now that I've cut them back, are already starting to kind of look like mame bonsai. So I might end up potting them down into tiny little containers and not really growing them out much more than I already have. Or I can stick them out in the field and let them continue growing on for a while. Usually the stock that we grow out to larger size is kept in gallon containers. And so you can see that these guys, another year and a half on from that point, have really started to bulk up, and you get more of the mature bark characteristics starting to come out on those, and you get more bulking, obviously. So hope that helps you guys with some elm propagation. If you have experience propagating elms and you'd like to share it with everyone, put it in the comments below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.